Hello, welcome back to another video. This week I experimented with another traditional medium, gouache, in a landscape study. Let me walk you through my process when trying new mediums and, of course, feel free to paint or draw along. Friday morning, I woke up to the silence of snowfall. Usually by this time of the winter, we've had several snowstorms, but it's been an unusually warm winter so far. This was the first time in a long time I've been able to bask in the quiet of falling snow, and it inspired me to try something new. After making my customary cup of tea, I headed up to my desk and started warming up. I used a mechanical pencil with blue lead to sketch and a 2B pencil to draw in the final lines. If you're interested, I've linked my Pinterest boards below so you can see the kind of reference I use for warm-ups. Like I've mentioned before, I'm working on finishing the sketchbook that I put down years ago. For now, the sketchbook has been designated the warm-up sketchbook. Everything in it is loose, sometimes experimental, and made entirely without expectations beyond stretching out my mind and hand. Right now, I have several sketchbooks I'm in the middle of or almost finished with. I'm looking forward to finishing this one because I want to make a theme sketchbook with my next one. My favorite sketchbook I've completed is one dedicated to mammals I finished during the summer last year. Picking a theme or subject matter and sticking to it makes the flip through a satisfying experience, but also makes answering "what do you want to draw" easier when you use that particular sketchbook. Let me know if you want a video on my sketchbook habits, tips, and tricks. Once I finished warming up, I decided to turn my attention to the day's study, a landscape. The link to my reference is in the description if you want to try this yourself. Last week, I made a pet portrait while studying Sargent style, but this week I wanted to study a medium. I have some 10 or maybe even 15-year-old gouache sitting in a box in the basement that I unearthed several months ago. I decided to try it and quickly sketched out and transferred the rough guidelines of a study onto watercolor paper using a light box. I kept most of the major elements the same as the photo reference, but changed a few things in the foreground to make a more interesting composition. As tempting as another style study would be, I decided not to do that. Trying a new medium would be hard enough by itself. When I study things, I usually try to focus on only one aspect, like style, color, or in this case, medium. I find that I usually learn more about that singular aspect and end up with more successful study sessions that way, because I'm not trying to juggle a bunch of things all at once. Before recording the final study, I made some preliminary tests off to the side on the same sheet of paper. I've only used gouache one time before, and the last time was back before I knew there was a difference between gouache and regular watercolor. I didn't record most of these because I wanted my full attention on how the medium behaved, but I managed to find one clip of the last test. This is an important part of trying a new medium for me because it gives me the confidence to try something larger, like the final study with the techniques I picked up in the testing phase. When I thought I had a basic understanding of how the paint behaved, I started the final study. These first layers are in watercolor. Yes, I'm using the Winsor Cotman travel set again, if you were wondering. I enjoy how easily colors blend wet on wet in watercolor and the lovely transparent quality of the dry paint, so I wanted to take advantage of these qualities in these first few layers. I worked back to front so I wouldn't have to worry about painting around the mid and foreground elements. There was some streakiness and blotchiness in these first layers, but I wasn't too worried. Most of these layers would be covered up later. My favorite part of this phase of the study was painting in the pine trees. There's something calming about dotting in branches and drawing trunks over and over again. Once everything was fully dry, I took white gouache and started blocking in the lightest values like the snow-covered ground and the fluffy clouds above. I forgot to do this before painting in the foreground tree and bush, so the bottom parts of these elements will be a foggy green for a while. During my mini studies, I realized I needed to paint in all my darkest sky values before adding clouds and gouache to ensure there would be enough contrast between the blue of the sky and the lightness of the clouds. Like watercolor, I needed to wait for the gouache to fully dry to maintain clean edges between brush strokes. The second layer helped better define the edges and volume of each mass of cloud. When we think of clouds, we often picture something that is completely soft and fluffy, But if we only use round, white shapes, painted clouds soon start to feel flat. In reality, clouds have light and shadow areas, soft and hard edges where light catches against the water particles, and subtle hue shifts throughout. Trying to capture all of this at once can be overwhelming, so I focused on the big shapes in the first pass, then medium shapes in the second pass, small shapes in the third, and so on. If you want to work hyper-realistically, however, it can be helpful to focus in on one tiny area at a time, but since I wanted a better understanding of overall form, volume, and texture, I worked large to small. While waiting for the clouds to dry, I dotted in the snow-capped peaks of the distant mountains and redefined the bottom parts of the foreground. I tried to reserve the details and darkest values for the foreground itself. This helps reinforce the idea of depth and atmospheric perspective. As we move back in space, things farther away have less contrast and fewer details because there is more air, aka atmosphere, between the viewer and the objects. Keeping this in mind will give your paintings depth and a sense of scale. When the sky was dry, I added a third pass of white gouache just on the very tops of the clouds and mountains to define the lightest and brightest areas of the painting. I still wasn't completely happy with how things looked, but I've learned from experience that sometimes you just need to step back before you can figure out a solution. The foreground was a good place to focus next. I wanted this area to have the most detail as the focal point of the painting. After solidifying the silhouette, I began dotting on a mixture of yellow ochre and permanent green. This is when I started to really appreciate gouache as a medium. In watercolor, I have no choice but to work light to dark because of the transparent nature of the medium. Gouache lets me work dark to light, like I did here. I found it much more satisfying to pick out individual branches this way because it resembled sculpting with color. Adding these highlights helped separate this tree from the background. Before, the darks were muddling together, but this pass helped define the differences in distance between this specific tree and the forest. After a quick break, I decided to add some shadows to the clouds. My original idea was to let the watercolor base peek through the gouache to act as shadows, but there just wasn't enough contrast. Between layers, I popped back to the foreground to add more detail to the tree and little bush. I've heard about the dry shift in gouache, and now that the previous pass was dry, I realized this area needed a little extra love to punch up the detail again. I still wasn't satisfied with the clouds, and I eventually realized they were too busy. While the clouds are an important part of the composition, they were getting too much attention. It can be scary to paint over details, but in this case it was necessary to redefine the overall forms, and I was much happier with how they looked afterwards. I realized that it is easier to accidentally leave too many visible brush strokes with gouache compared to watercolor, but that it is also easy to remedy this with another layer on top. Another thing I realized is that paint consistency matters much more with gouache. I had to mist the palette with water to keep the paint from drying out several times. Part of this may be due to the paint's age and the fact that it comes from a budget brand. Paying attention to how creamy the paint was ended up being key to minimizing unwanted texture overall, and this is something I will be practicing moving forward. After a few more passes, I decided to put the gouache away and to add those final, satisfying details with, my Posca acrylic paint pen. After this, I was done. I hope you enjoyed this look at a landscape study in a new medium. At times, the study was frustrating, but ultimately it was rewarding to try something new and learn about how to handle and use gouache on top of watercolor. Besides being my first gouache study, this was also my first study made entirely with wet mediums. I hope to do more studies in the future with both wet and dry media, with a variety of subjects. Please feel free to leave suggestions down below in the comments if you want to see something in particular. Anyway, thanks for watching this far. I'll see you next week with another video. Bye!